Welcome to Freethought Matters. I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters. This is a talk show devoted to free thought and secularism.
Coming up, we're going to talk with two experts about religious maltreatment of children.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. What is religious child abuse and religious maltreatment of children? This is a far-reaching and tragic subject. Today, we're going to talk about scriptural instructions that promote child abuse, about how toxic theology affects children, often for their entire lives, about sexual abuse by churches or religious institutions, about conversion therapy laws that give religion a pass, and even how abstinence instead of comprehensive sex education injures young students. Our guests will also talk about how all of this has been compounded by the pandemic.
With us to discuss these and other provocative issues are Janet Heimlich, author of Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment. Thanks so much for joining us, Janet.
It's great to see you both.
And then also joining us is Dr. Terri Daniel. She's a grief counselor and, take note of this, she's a non-religious hospice chaplain. She's the founder of the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief. She's a certified clinical trauma specialist and also specializes in bereavement and trauma support. Dr. Daniel is also an end-of-life advisor. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Daniel.
Thank you. So good to be with you guys.
So both of our guests serve on the board of Child Friendly Faith. But before we talk about all of this, Janet, I do have to ask you about your last name, Heimlich, which is a very famous name, and you have a personal relationship with that name. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, my father, Dr. Henry Heimlich, invented the Heimlich maneuver, which it gets used literally every day around the world to save people from choking. So he passed away about 5 years ago and left a great legacy.
So he was saving lives, and now you're continuing that legacy with your work.
I think, as someone who actually read my book cover to cover and wanted to talk about it all the time, my dad, and who also came out as an atheist while he was reading it, he would love your comparison, Dan.
Huh.
And yes, you are continuing that work to help people. So tell us generally about what does the Bible say about corporal punishment, the treatment of children. How is Scripture used to create child maltreatment in the name of religion?
Well, I think it's first important to understand that the Bible's perception of children starts at a very bad place. When I was working on my research on the Bible, I wanted to find every mention of children in it. And just about all of it was said in a kind of pejorative, controlling way. And then when it was mentioned, it was often about as you point out, essentially using physical punishment to control their actions. And there are also many just mythical stories in the Bible that present children, as victims of rape, victims of incest, and just horrible, murderous crimes, some committed by a deity. So I think that lays the groundwork. But yeah, there are certain very today, very very often stated rules about how you're to raise children, and that includes authoritarian parenting, using physical punishment, and again, it's really based on the need to control rather than nurture.
So we're looking at things like the Mosaic Law had a rule that you could stone stubborn children. And then there's the famous "spare the rod, spoil the child," or verses like "blueness of the wound cleanseth the soul." That's the kind of thing that you're talking about.
Yeah. Now, "spare the rod, spoil the child" doesn't literally appear in the Bible, but that poem that it comes from does borrow from the "spare the rod" verbiage from the Bible. And there's no question really that it has to do with taking a verb hand, and in the best sense you can perceive or interpret. It's again, controlling and sometimes using physical punishment, and that, yes, there is some value in actually having an injury. And then, of course, we have many other passages that may not necessarily speak to children, but for adults that want to use biblical passages to justify maltreatment of kids, abuse and neglect of children. There's plenty there, such as, the need to always seek forgiveness for anything you do wrong. So children, for example, are pressured sometimes to seek forgiveness for having spoken up about themselves as victims of sexual abuse. The list goes on.
Before we turn to Terri, just a follow-up question for you, Janet. Why did you name this book "Breaking Their Will," and how does religious maltreatment connect with breaking children's will?
I named it "Breaking Their Will" because it really drives at the heart of what I see as the main problem behind really all of these crimes, which is to not acknowledge that children are worthy of autonomy, that children don't deserve to carve out their own beliefs and perceptions of the world. So again, it's just yes, the breaking of the will is something that is tossed around a lot in fundamentalist religious cultures. The need to break children of their sinfulness, or what turns out to be really very natural approaches to the world. The need to explore and follow up with curiosity and critical thinking. So breaking their will runs contrary to that. But I also look at it in a more expansive way, as I've described.
So, Dr. Daniel, can I call you Terri?
Of course.
Terri, so talking about how religious ideas influence how we treat children, you sometimes use the phrase toxic theology. What do you mean by toxic theology?
Well, I can't take credit for that phrase. The phrase has been floating around the culture for a while, and there's actually been a good bit of academic research done on it, where it's kind of been identified some characteristics of what researchers and counselors and people who work with this would consider toxic theology. So a couple of examples, it would be a closed system what we would call a high demand religious structure, where you're separated from the outside world, where you're taught to see everybody who's not in your immediate group as evil and going to hell, not allowed to, participate in current events or read books or anything like that. Toxic theology also presents this idea of a God watching over you who judges everything you do, so that children grow up being afraid, as Janet was just saying, to just be children. This idea that they're being watched all the time. And then, of course, the big one is the protector punisher image of God, where on one hand, you're raising children to think that God is this wonderful, loving, protective parent. And on the other hand, that God is going to beat the crap out of you the minute you do the slightest thing wrong. And then, of course, if you're teaching children the Bible, they're going to see evidence of that exact cognitive dissonance in all the Bible stories that they're being told.
Well, in hell, too, that whole idea of eternal
isn't that toxic?
A lot of kids are traumatized by the idea that they might end up in fire someday.
Absolutely. And technically burning in hell for eternity is also not in the Bible. That was kind of added later by the early church founders. But in my field, where I specialize with people dealing with grief, both children and adults, the hell piece is by far the worst, because when you're thinking about death and you're indoctrinated with that religious structure, there's only two possibilities: heaven and hell. And there are so many reasons for somebody to go to hell that pretty much everybody's going to go there, and nobody really gets off the hook. So even a child who's experienced the death of a parent who perhaps wasn't a model citizen — I've had children say this to me, my dad was an alcoholic. He died in a car crash for driving drunk. Is he going to go to hell? And a child is asking me this question. And professionally, what I'm not allowed to say is, of course not, kid, there is no hell. But I have to be more diplomatic than that. So it's really a problem. And then the kids take these conundrums home to their parents and ask these questions. And are the parents prepared to give them anything useful to help them cope with the grief and with the cognitive dissonance? Generally not, because the parents are the ones who indoctrinated them that way in the first place.
So the Bible does talk about the lake of fire. Maybe that's hell.
Wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Well, yeah, and then Jesus said the branches are cast into the flame. So maybe, a lot of theologians would interpret that as hell. We're going to take a break, both of you. When we come back, Terri, I want to ask about your phrase about the futility of prayer. Is prayer useful, or is it even harmful?
And we'll talk with Janet a little bit more about things like why abstinence in the schools ends up being maltreatment of children.
We'll be back with more Freethought Matters after this.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Jarvis, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. There are many reasons why I'm an atheist, but I'll start with the crudest explanation. I'm sure many of you have seen Clash of the Titans or The Immortals or 300, these blockbuster films about ancient Greek or Roman religion, which we now call mythology. But back then it wasn't mythology. It was very real for them. They genuinely believed that you had to put a coin in a person's mouth before they were buried so that they could pay for the literal ferry to the afterlife. Just as many people today believe that they should eat crackers and wine on a Sunday, or that God wants women to hide their bodies under black burqas. Every religion that has ever existed, and there are many, have all believed that they were right, that their rituals and rules and beliefs were 100% correct, and they all thought they nailed it. But where are they today? If they're not completely forgotten, they're on the silver screen, amusing us with their sword fights, animal sacrifices, and oracles. The religions of today are the entertainment of tomorrow. Everyone, I hope, is an atheist about Zeus and Apollo, Juno and Poseidon. I just added Jesus and Muhammad to that list.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. I'm Dan Barker.
I'm Laurie Gaylor. We are talking with Janet Heimlich, who's the author of Breaking Their Will, and Dr. Terri Daniel, who is a non-religious chaplain who specializes in many issues, including bereavement and toxic religion and its effects on children. And we were just briefly talking about the abstinence issue in the schools. And Janet, I know you have something brief to talk about that.
Yeah, it's one of some key issues that our nonprofit, the Child Friendly Faith Project, is really looking into, which is the fact that public schools are teaching abstinence-only education instead of a comprehensive sex ed program after some fundamentalist Christian organizations have lobbied them to let them kind of take over for after-school programs. And the schools are strapped for cash, and so they say sure. And so these kids are getting this really unhealthy view of things like purity, and then of course not being taught evidence-based teachings relating to the issue of healthy sex ed. So that's really denying these kids a really important part of their education.
So briefly, what is child-friendly faith?
Well, a lot of secular folks have taken issue with me for even coming up with that description. And I think it's really worth having a discussion about just if there can be child-friendly faith. I know that many folks feel that doesn't exist. What I think is important is to accept the fact that adults around the world, whether they are going to believe in some sort of traditional religious type ideology or something really newfangled, like the earth is flat or whatever, QAnon, that this way of treating children in abusive and neglectful ways is going to continue unless we step in to say, here's how you can still believe in whatever you want to believe, but let's learn about healthy ways to raise children so that you can kind of do both. But the idea that, well, if we just got rid of all religion, there wouldn't be those forms of child abuse and neglect, just I don't think bears out with evidence.
But religion tends to exacerbate the problem. It tends to magnify it, doesn't it?
I think because of two reasons. One, you may have just abusive folks that, will just love that grab bag of religious dictums and so forth that justify whatever they want to do to a kid. But also you have religious organizations that are set up with these really hierarchical power structures. And so that just sets up a whole, sometimes community where you have an unhealthy social structure that gives people, at the top a whole lot of power, that gives women oftentimes very little, that gives children, next to no power to even be heard. So yeah, I think that is true. But I do think other ideologies can accomplish that as well. You certainly will see the similar things as you would in less religious but authoritarian type countries like North Korea and other places.
So Dr. Daniel, Terri, you've also used the phrase the futility of prayer. Tell us more about that.
Well, as a hospice chaplain and a hospital chaplain, I encounter people wanting me to pray with them all the time. And I have a way to sort of work around that. But in that context, I have seen so many people praying that their loved one will get better, that they'll come out of the surgery, whatever the thing happens to be. And what happens when the prayer doesn't work? You'll have a family in one room praying for somebody who's very ill. You'll have another family in the next room doing their praying. One patient lives, the other patient dies. Talk about cognitive dissonance. Whatever format people use for prayer, it cannot change the outcome of events. But religious people believe that it can, and they believe this fiercely. And what happens when the prayers fail to produce the desired outcome, the people doing the praying blame themselves because they are either being punished for a sin that they may not even be aware that they did, or their faith wasn't strong enough. So if the person in this room, their person dies and your person lives, you had a stronger faith than the people in the next hospital room.
Don't you think some people are just praying for comfort? It's like, thy will be done. They're not necessarily expecting the laws of nature to be violated, but do you think there's some value in that maybe?
Some people do pray that way, and when I am asked to pray, when patients ask me, that's exactly what I do. I offer a little neutral prayer like, let's take a deep breath and open our hearts and ask that we can find inside ourselves the strength to walk through this challenge with grace. I'll use some of their language, grace and a sense of safety and knowing that we are loved and we are safe on this journey. That's the kind of prayer.
Secular prayer.
Totally secular.
But
yes.
I see your point about the planting this insidious idea that somehow, because prayers, God is supposed to answer your prayer if he thinks you're right, he lets your child die and another live.
And if I could add to that, to what Terri said in terms of how this impacts the lives of children, adults, after having had their life experiences for however long, they can decide for themselves what role prayer fits into their life. And they can maybe package it in a way that they can then continue believing what they are believing, that cognitive dissonance that Terri was talking about. But for children, they don't have that luxury. And so instead, adults are, they're just kind of going through the motions to oftentimes gain the approval of their loved ones. And I think the area where this is the most insidious are in cases involving religious medical neglect, because you will have, say, a child that is told to either pray for someone else who's very sick, perhaps dying, or sometimes there are others praying, using faith, quote, healing practices on the child. And in both cases, if the outcome is very bad, you can imagine the kind of stress and anxiety and ongoing type of mental health issues that child is going to contend with.
And of course, so many states, including the state of Wisconsin, where we're filming this, allow exceptions for parents to not give medical treatment to their children because they're religious, and that really is
they give alternate religious treatment,
right?
Like Christian Science practitioners.
Truly, child maltreatment. So many tragic cases.
Can I give an example relative to that?
Mm-hmm.
And this was a famous case. It was on the news. A little boy named Gaylor Bradley was diagnosed with brain cancer, very fast growing. And there was a news segment about, here's this little 10-year-old in his classroom, And everybody knows about his diagnosis, and the kids are throwing him a party. And the teacher says to the kids, let's all pray, because if we pray for Kyler, God will listen to us. And the news reporter is saying, Kyler, do you believe in prayer? And he's like, yes, if we all pray, God will listen. So Kyler Radley died about 3 weeks after this news segment was filmed. And all of those children, I think safely assuming, went home to their parents, having their first really traumatic encounter with toxic theology, saying, what happened? We all prayed. I thought God was supposed to listen to us, and Kyler died. So now we have this whole community of kids, beginning their life as adults with this conundrum and in the middle of their grief.
Just about a minute left for both of you to tell us, how has the pandemic made this worse? Maltreatment of children. You want to start, Terri?
Well, it's made it worse from my perspective as a hospice worker, just because so many more people are dying. But I don't have a lot of children in hospice. Parents don't generally put their children in hospice because with children, there's always hope. Always hope, hope, hope. You want to do everything to the last minute. So there's not a big population of children's hospice. So I see it really more with adults, and obviously the pandemic has caused so much more death.
And anything you want to add, Janet, to conclude this?
I'm just concerned that it intensifies the type of isolation that a lot of children already have to experience, such as those who were homeschooled in a really oppressive way, where faith communities are, controlling a lot of what goes on within, whether it's a church or mosque or what have you. And so when you have even less connection with, say, outside services, such as child protective services and that kind of a thing, it makes it even harder for those outside authorities to come in when there's a problem or hear about it.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Janet Heimlich and Terri Daniel, for joining us and for your work to help protect children.
Thank you so much
for having us.
It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace.
Let's restore respect for America's secular roots. Help the Freedom from Religion Foundation defend the wall of separation between state and church. Join us at ffrf.org. Freedom depends on freethinkers.